Let me tell you something you might not want to hear. When an avoidant leaves, it's not always a phase. It's not always a they'll come back when they realize what they've lost moment. Sometimes they're gone because of you. Not because you're not good enough, but because you represented something they were actively trying to avoid. Avoidants don't come back to just anyone. They especially don't come back to the people who triggered their deepest fears. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. These aren't just personality types. They're patterns, behaviors, and energies that make avoidants run for the hills and never look back. If you've been chasing closure, waiting for that text, hoping they'll miss you, this is the moment you stop waiting and start understanding. Because when you know why they're not coming back, you gain the power to stop making yourself the place they flee from and start becoming the person they'd regret losing. There's a moment in every relationship where things start to feel real. Maybe you've been seeing each other for a few weeks. The chemistry is strong, the laughs come easily, and there's this exciting pull that keeps drawing you closer. And then, just when things start to deepen, when the connection begins to go beneath the surface, something shifts. They start replying a little less often, plans fall through more easily, and you start feeling like you're the only one trying to keep the connection alive. What happened? This is often the moment where someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to feel emotionally exposed. It's not that they don't like you. It's not even that they didn't enjoy being with you. But for avoidants, closeness often triggers discomfort. And when they sense that the relationship is heading toward deeper emotional territory, their instinct is to pull back. Fast. Now, if you're the kind of person who naturally leans into connection, who believes in vulnerability and opening up as a way to build intimacy, this reaction can feel confusing and painful. You're just being genuine. You're just expressing how you feel. Maybe you shared something personal. Maybe you asked a question that required them to go deeper than they were comfortable with. Or maybe you simply said something like, I really enjoy spending time with you, a little too soon for their emotional timeline. To you, it might have felt sweet or honest. To them, it may have felt like pressure. That pressure, whether it was real or perceived, is enough to trigger the emotional alarm bells for someone who fears intimacy. An avoidant person doesn't always know why they're withdrawing. It can happen subtly, even unconsciously. But one of the most common triggers is the experience of feeling emotionally seen or exposed before they're ready. If you've ever opened up in a moment of connection and then watched them disappear soon after, this might be exactly what happened. Avoidants have built protective strategies that help them stay in control of their emotional environment. One of those strategies is limiting vulnerability, both their own and others. So when you, with your open heart and honest communication, step into the dynamic with full emotional presence, it challenges that system. It pushes up against their defenses. And instead of feeling closer to you, they feel threatened by the very closeness you're trying to offer. What's hard about this is that it's often the most emotionally intelligent, sincere people who find themselves in this situation. People who've done the work. People who understand that relationships require realness. But with avoidance, emotional depth is something that has to be very carefully navigated. It's not that they never want it, it's that it terrifies them. And when someone triggers that terror by being too emotionally forward, too soon, the instinct is to run. Sometimes they ghost. Sometimes they slowly drift. Sometimes they create conflict out of nowhere to justify the distance. But the result is the same. They're gone. If this is you, if you've been told you're too much, too intense, or that things were moving too fast, even though you were just being emotionally honest, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means your level of vulnerability was incompatible with where the other person was emotionally. And here's the kicker. Avoidants rarely come back to the people who made them feel that kind of emotional exposure. Because in their mind, that person becomes a symbol of the emotional discomfort they experienced. Even if you weren't demanding anything, even if you didn't ask for a relationship or try to define the connection, the mere act of allowing yourself to be fully seen, of putting your heart on the table, is enough to make them feel like they've lost control. And when an avoidant loses control, they retreat to the one place that feels safe: distance. So, while you may be replaying the last conversation in your head, wondering if you should have said less, expressed less, or waited longer before showing your cards, understand that the issue was never really about timing or phrasing. It was about what your openness represented. To an avoidant, emotional depth can feel like quicksand, pulling them into a space where they can't breathe. And once they associate you with that feeling, they don't just avoid the connection, they avoid the version of themselves they felt they were becoming with you. There's a certain kind of energy that can feel incredibly overwhelming to someone with an avoidant attachment style. It's the energy of pursuit. When one person is always the initiator, always reaching out, always planning, always asking where things are going. At first, it might not seem like a problem. In fact, avoidants are often drawn to people who make the effort, who show enthusiasm, who take the lead in creating connection. That initial pursuit can feel flattering, affirming, even comforting. It gives them space to engage on their terms without having to put themselves too far out there. But over time, the dynamic shifts. What starts as pleasant attention begins to feel like pressure. The more you chase, the more they retreat. It's not because you're doing something wrong in a universal sense. It's because you're doing something that challenges their core need for emotional distance. Avoidants crave autonomy more than almost anything in a relationship. When someone shows up with a lot of emotional energy, checking in frequently, expressing strong feelings early on, trying to define the relationship or asking for more closeness, it can feel suffocating. Even if you're not asking for commitment, the mere feeling that you're emotionally invested becomes too much. They may start to interpret your pursuit as neediness, even if that's not your intention. That's one of the most painful parts for someone on the receiving end of an avoidance withdrawal. You may feel like you are just showing care, interest, and intention, but to them, it registers as a threat to their independence. The constant pursuer often doesn't realize they're chasing until the distance becomes too obvious. Maybe you're always the one texting first. Maybe you're trying to keep the spark alive by initiating calls, checking in, planning dates, trying to reignite the emotional connection you felt at the beginning. But every message you send, every plan you propose, every attempt you make to get clarity, if it's not matched, it starts to shift the power dynamic. You become the one trying to hold the connection together while they're the one slowly slipping away. And the more you try to fix it by doing more, the more you reinforce the very pattern that's pushing them further out. For someone who is avoidant, pursuit doesn't read as love. It reads as loss of control. They begin to feel like they're being pulled into something they didn't fully sign up for. Even if they were interested at first, the act of being chased can trigger a deep need to preserve emotional space. It's not personal. It's not even rational half the time. It's a protective response, one that tells them the safest way to feel secure is to be alone or emotionally distant. So when you keep trying to understand, trying to communicate, trying to reconnect, they don't see that as effort. They see it as a threat to their sense of peace. That threat causes them to detach, and in many cases, detach permanently. What makes this especially confusing is that in the early stages, many avoidants invite the attention. They might flirt back, engage in deep conversations, even express vulnerability. They like being liked, but the moment that attention becomes too consistent, too committed, too certain, they start to panic. It's not that they didn't enjoy your pursuit. It's that they didn't want to be pursued beyond a certain point. That point, unfortunately, is rarely communicated clearly. You only know you've passed it when they start to withdraw. If you're someone who naturally expresses affection by giving, by doing, by showing up, it can feel like rejection on a deep level, especially when you know your intentions were pure. But avoidants don't respond to intention. They respond to impact. And if your consistent pursuit made them feel trapped or emotionally obligated, even unintentionally, they associate you with discomfort. That discomfort turns into avoidance. And once they've built that association in their mind, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. You can't reason your way back into their life. You can't explain that you were just trying to connect. The narrative they've formed about you is already settled. This is why so many people feel blindsided when an avoidant cuts things off and never returns. They remember how much effort they put in. They remember the times they showed up, made plans, checked in, gave the benefit of the doubt. But for the avoidant, That very effort was the problem. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were too much for what they were emotionally willing to give. One of the most common traps people fall into when dating someone with an avoidant attachment style is stepping into the role of the fixer. It's the instinct that kicks in when you notice emotional unavailability, inconsistency, or signs of past trauma in someone you care about. You start to see their behavior not as a reflection of their limits, but as a reflection of their wounds, wounds you believe you can help them heal. This doesn't come from a bad place. It comes from empathy, from a deep desire to connect, and from the belief that with enough love, patience, and understanding, you can bring them out of their shell. You want to show them that not everyone leaves, that emotional intimacy doesn't have to be painful, that they are safe with you. But to an avoidant, being with someone who tries to fix them can feel like an intrusion into the very space they rely on to feel emotionally in control. The dynamic between a fixer and an avoidant almost always begins with potential. There's an attraction to opposites. The fixer feels useful, needed, even heroic, and the avoidant is drawn to the care and warmth that's being offered. The fixer picks up on the subtle clues. The avoidant doesn't trust easily, seems uncomfortable with emotional conversations, has a history of failed or short-lived relationships. Instead of taking this as a warning, the fixer sees it as an opportunity. They think, I'll be the exception. I'll be the one who breaks through. And so they start making themselves indispensable, offering emotional support, initiating vulnerable conversations, making excuses for the avoidant's distance or coldness, and constantly trying to show that they're safe and different. But this approach, as well-intentioned as it might be, often has the opposite effect. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to perceived control. When someone enters their emotional world and starts suggesting what they should work on, or constantly points out their defense mechanisms, it triggers resistance. It may look like helpfulness from the outside, but to the avoidant, it feels like pressure to change. And that pressure threatens the autonomy they work so hard to protect. Even subtle attempts to help them feel more or love more or commit more can come across as emotional manipulation. It puts them in a position where they're no longer accepted for who they are, but seen as a project. And no one wants to feel like someone else's project. This is why avoidants rarely return to the people who tried to fix them. Because even though the fixer may have shown love and care, they also, often unintentionally, sent a message that who the avoidant is isn't good enough. That they need to evolve into something else in order to be worthy of love. That they are broken, and whether that message was explicit or simply implied through repeated emotional interventions, it sticks. Over time, the avoidant doesn't feel safe. They feel analyzed. They don't feel embraced. They feel exposed. And instead of feeling gratitude for the support, they begin to feel resentment. Because the very love they were offered came with conditions. Become more open, more vulnerable, more communicative, and then you'll be truly lovable. For someone with an avoidant style, being in a relationship where they feel like a constant self-improvement project is exhausting. They may not be consciously aware of it, but on some level, they begin to associate the fixer with emotional discomfort. And once that association is made, it becomes nearly impossible to reset the dynamic. Even after distance, even after time has passed, they remember how they felt in the relationship, not just the connection or the good moments, but the sense of being constantly nudged toward change. It doesn't matter how lovingly it was done. What matters is that they didn't feel fully seen as they were. This is particularly painful for the fixer because they often gave everything. They were patient, loyal, emotionally available, and often sacrificed their own needs just to make the other person feel safe. But in the end, they feel discarded and confused. How could someone walk away from all that love? The answer is that it didn't feel like love to the avoidant. It felt like pressure to heal, pressure to grow, pressure to be something they weren't ready or willing to become. And that pressure creates emotional burnout. The more the fixer tries to hold space, the more the avoidant pulls away. Not because they don't appreciate the effort, but because they can't exist in a dynamic where they're constantly being shown that they're not enough until they change. One of the fastest ways to push an avoidant away, often without realizing it, is by ignoring or subtly disrespecting their boundaries. Boundaries are the lifeline for someone with an avoidant attachment style. They aren't just preferences or temporary needs, they are the guardrails that help them feel safe and emotionally regulated in relationships. When those boundaries are crossed, even in ways that feel small or unintentional, the avoidant doesn't just feel irritated, they feel invaded. And when someone makes them feel emotionally invaded, even with the best of intentions, it triggers a deep internal response that says, "This isn't safe anymore." People who ignore boundaries don't always do so maliciously. In fact, they're often driven by love, passion, or a strong desire to connect. Maybe you thought it would be okay to call even after they said they needed space. Maybe you brought up a heavy emotional conversation during a moment when they clearly didn't want to go there. Maybe you pushed for more clarity in the relationship even after they told you they weren't ready to define things. In your mind, you were just being honest. You were trying to connect. You were expressing your truth. But to the avoidant, it felt like a violation, an emotional crossing of a line that they had clearly, though sometimes subtly, drawn. The most difficult part is that avoidants often don't express their boundaries in bold, direct terms. They might hint at needing space rather than saying it outright. They might withdraw instead of explaining why they feel overwhelmed. This makes it incredibly easy to misread their signals, especially if you're someone who values closeness and connection. You might assume that if they're not speaking up, everything is fine. So you lean in a little more. You reach out again. You try harder, not because you're trying to control them, but because you care. But in the avoidance internal world, what you're doing is confirming their fear, that closeness means losing their ability to breathe. When someone consistently ignores or challenges their boundaries, the avoidant begins to experience what feels like emotional claustrophobia. It's not just discomfort, it's panic. They feel like they're losing control of the one thing that keeps them emotionally safe: distance. So even if the relationship started with warmth and attraction, that sense of being emotionally cornered becomes louder than anything else. And once they associate you with that feeling, it doesn't matter how loving, kind, or well-meaning you are, the instinct becomes escape. Not conversation, not compromise, just space. And once they create that space, they don't often come back. Not because they're punishing you, but because returning would mean returning to a version of connection that made them feel emotionally trapped. What's especially painful for the person on the receiving end is the feeling of being misunderstood. You weren't trying to suffocate them. You were just trying to connect in a way that made sense to you. Maybe you thought your emotional availability would help them open up. Maybe you believed that if you were consistent enough, supportive enough, understanding enough, they'd finally feel safe letting their guard down. But instead, the more you tried to be present, the more they interpreted your presence as pressure. It wasn't your love that scared them. It was the perceived demand that came with it. Boundaries, for avoidance, are not up for negotiation. Even when they seem flexible, even when they seem okay in the moment, they are always tracking how much space they feel they have. When that space begins to shrink, when the relationship starts to feel like something they have to manage or protect themselves from, they start planning their exit. And because avoidants tend to be conflict averse, they often don't announce their exit. They just start pulling away. The texts get shorter, the calls become less frequent, the emotional tone cools, and soon they disappear altogether. Not with anger, not even necessarily with resentment, but with the quiet certainty that they don't want to return to a dynamic where their boundaries weren't honored. This isn't about being perfect. It's not about walking on eggshells or tiptoeing around their every emotional need. But to someone with an avoidant attachment style, consistent boundary pushing, no matter how well intended, creates a sense of emotional erosion. They begin to feel that their preferences don't matter, that their pacing isn't being respected, that their inner world is being intruded on without consent. And the moment that feeling sets in, the connection no longer feels like a source of comfort. It feels like a threat. There's a dynamic that can quietly sabotage a connection with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, and it often hides beneath the surface of what looks like vulnerability. It's the use of vulnerability not as a bridge to genuine intimacy, but as a weapon. This happens when emotional openness is used to guilt, manipulate, or create emotional leverage. In the early stages of a relationship, Vulnerability is beautiful. It creates connection, trust, and shared understanding. But when vulnerability is used as a tactic, whether consciously or unconsciously, it makes avoidants run for the exit and rarely return. The person who weaponizes vulnerability doesn't usually realize they're doing it. They may have been hurt before, disappointed, ghosted, or overlooked in past relationships. So when they finally decide to open up to someone, especially someone they're really into, there's a huge emotional investment tied to that act. They believe that sharing their feelings, whether it's fear, sadness, insecurity, or love, should be met with reassurance, affirmation, or reciprocity. And when it's not, they feel betrayed. That betrayal quickly turns into a need to express their pain, often in a way that makes the other person feel responsible for it. This might show up as dramatic emotional reactions, passive-aggressive comments, guilt-tripping, or pressing someone to respond to their vulnerability in a very specific way. Avoidants have a deep sensitivity to emotional intensity, especially when it's directed at them in moments when they're pulling back. If they sense that someone is using their own emotional openness as a way to control the narrative, like saying, "I opened up to you and now you're doing this," or "I trusted you and look how you're treating me," they begin to feel emotionally ambushed. What might have started as a moment of sincere connection suddenly feels like an emotional trap. They don't feel like they're being invited to connect. They feel like they're being punished for not responding the way someone else needed them to. That sense of emotional pressure becomes overwhelming, and in their mind, the only way to regain control is to cut ties completely. In these moments, vulnerability stops feeling like love and starts feeling like obligation. It becomes a demand for emotional caretaking that avoidants aren't wired to handle. They don't want to feel like someone else's emotional stability is dependent on their actions, especially when they're already struggling to regulate their own emotional boundaries. And when someone begins to frame their hurt in a way that suggests the avoidant is to blame just for being themselves, just for needing space or not being able to give more, they internalize that as a sign that this connection isn't emotionally safe. This doesn't mean that expressing hurt is wrong. Relationships require honesty, but there's a difference between sharing how you feel and using your feelings to influence someone's behavior out of guilt or fear. The line gets crossed when vulnerability becomes a form of control, when emotions are wielded in a way that makes the other person feel like they have no choice but to respond the way you want, or else be labeled as cold, selfish, or unloving. Avoidants are highly attuned to these emotional shifts, and even if they can't articulate it clearly, they feel the shift the moment vulnerability stops being about connection and starts being about pressure. Over time, if this pattern continues, avoidants begin to associate the other person not with warmth or safety, but with emotional volatility. They remember how every conversation about feelings turned into a moment of tension. They recall the way vulnerability was always followed by an expectation that they had to reassure, explain, or fix something they didn't feel capable of fixing, and so they disengage, not with malice, but with self-protection. They begin to see the relationship as something that requires constant emotional performance, where any wrong move could lead to guilt, conflict, or emotional fallout. For the person who expressed that vulnerability, this can be deeply confusing. They may feel like they were just being honest, just sharing from the heart, just trying to build something real. But to the avoidant, it didn't feel like real connection. It felt like emotional responsibility for someone else's wounds. And that's a burden they're not prepared to carry. The result is a slow but certain retreat. The texts become less responsive, the tone becomes more formal, and eventually the silence stretches into permanence. Not because they didn't care, but because they began to fear that caring would always come at the cost of their emotional freedom. There's a pattern that plays out in relationships where one person is emotionally avoidant and the other, without even realizing it, starts to mirror that emotional chaos. It happens subtly over time, especially when you're deeply invested in someone who's hot and cold, in and out, present one moment and distant the next. At first, you may have shown up with calm, clarity, and consistency. But as the unpredictability of the avoidant partner increases, something inside you shifts. You start reacting instead of responding. You start questioning instead of trusting. You begin to operate from the same place of insecurity, uncertainty, and emotional turbulence that they do. And once that happens, the dynamic becomes too unstable for the avoidant to stay in, because even though they may have unconsciously triggered the chaos, they can't handle being in it. Avoidants often crave emotional simplicity, not because they're emotionally simple people, but because emotional intensity feels threatening. They struggle within a conflict, and they manage that conflict by keeping others at arm's length. They need space. They need distance. They need a sense of control over how close someone can get. So when they start to behave in unpredictable ways, maybe they go silent for a few days, maybe they pull away after a vulnerable moment, maybe they avoid defining the relationship. They're doing it to regulate their emotional discomfort. But when the other person begins to mirror that energy, when they become anxious, reactive, or emotionally inconsistent, it triggers something avoidants can't cope with: reflection. Suddenly, the other person is showing the same instability they've been trying to hide within themselves. That person, who may have once been a source of calm and grounding, now reflects the very emotional mess the avoidant was trying to escape. Maybe it looks like constant overthinking. Maybe it's repeated attempts to decode mixed signals. Maybe it's sudden emotional outbursts after being ignored. Or maybe it's becoming cold, detached, and distant in response to the avoidant's withdrawal, mirroring the very behavior that created the disconnect in the first place. And even though these responses are completely human, completely understandable given the circumstances, to an avoidant, it feels like confirmation that intimacy leads to chaos. What's hard to see in the moment is that the chaos wasn't there from the beginning. It built slowly. The more emotional uncertainty the avoidant created, the more the other person tried to adapt. But in trying to adapt, they began to abandon their own emotional stability. They stopped showing up as the grounded version of themselves and started matching the avoidant's dysfunction. It's not about blame. It's about what happens when emotional inconsistency becomes the norm. The anxious person becomes reactive. The secure person becomes anxious. The calm communicator becomes suspicious, withdrawn, or defensive. And suddenly, the relationship is no longer about connection. It's about survival. Avoidants don't want to feel like they're in survival mode. They may not articulate it, but they're looking for relationships that feel emotionally manageable. So when someone begins to reflect back their own inner instability, it becomes overwhelming. It becomes too much to process. And instead of owning the fact that their behavior helped create the chaos, they blame the dynamic. They decide it's too much, too intense, too dramatic, and they leave. Not because the other person was too emotional, but because the avoidant couldn't handle being faced with a version of themselves they were trying to outrun. The most painful part of this is how much effort the other person often puts in to make the relationship work. They bend, they adjust, they become hyper-aware of their words and actions, all in an attempt to avoid triggering more distance. But in doing so, they slowly lose themselves. They become a version of themselves they barely recognize, someone anxious, reactive, emotionally volatile. And when the avoidant walks away, they don't just leave a relationship. They leave someone who's now carrying the emotional aftermath of trying to match energy that was never stable in the first place. To the avoidant, the person they leave behind no longer looks like the calm, steady partner they were initially attracted to. They now look like someone who can't handle the emotional landscape of the relationship. Ironically, even if the avoidant created that landscape, they still respond to it with retreat. They don't return to the person who mirrored their chaos, because doing so would mean facing their own role in the dynamic. It would mean acknowledging that their distance, inconsistency, and avoidance triggered someone else's unraveling, and that level of emotional accountability is something most avoidants aren't equipped to take on. So they move on. They convince themselves the connection wasn't right, that it became too messy, that it just didn't feel peaceful anymore. And they leave the person who tried to hold it all together standing in the wreckage, wondering how they became someone they never intended to be. There's a certain type of person that an avoidant will almost never come back to, the one who exposes their patterns too clearly. This is the person who sees through the mask, who names the behavior, who calls out the emotional distance for what it is. At first, this might seem like a quality that would draw the avoidant closer. After all, clarity, honesty, and emotional intelligence are often seen as strengths in any relationship. But for someone with an avoidant attachment style, being truly seen isn't comforting. It's confronting. They don't want someone who reads between the lines. They want someone who lets the silence stay silent, someone who doesn't question the withdrawal, someone who doesn't hold up a mirror to their patterns. The avoidant needs a certain level of emotional ambiguity to stay comfortable. As long as their behavior is not being scrutinized, they can maintain control of the narrative. They can come and go as they please. They can stay on the edge of emotional intimacy without being challenged to go deeper. But when they're with someone who notices the inconsistencies, who calmly says things like, "You seem to pull away whenever things get close," or "It feels like you're not emotionally available right now," they begin to feel exposed. That exposure doesn't make them lean in. It makes them retreat even faster. What's hard about this dynamic is that the person who sees the avoidant clearly is often coming from a place of compassion, not criticism. They're not trying to shame or blame. They're simply trying to create awareness, to have a conversation, to bring some truth into the space. But for the avoidant, it doesn't feel like awareness. It feels like threat. Their emotional world is heavily guarded, and any attempt to analyze, unpack, or name what's happening behind those walls feels intrusive. Even a gentle question about their intentions or emotions can be received as pressure, judgment, or emotional interrogation. And when someone consistently holds up that mirror, the avoidant doesn't see a partner. They see a threat to their emotional armor. Avoidants are often uncomfortable with their own emotional contradictions. They may want closeness, but push it away. They may initiate connection, but disappear when it starts to deepen. They may express affection one day and go silent the next. These patterns are not always intentional, but they are deeply ingrained. So when someone begins to notice and speak to those contradictions, it creates cognitive dissonance. The avoidant has to confront parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime avoiding. And most of the time, instead of leaning into that discomfort and growing through it, they choose the path of least resistance, distancing themselves from the person who sees too much. What's even more confusing is that the avoidant might seem intrigued at first. They may engage in deep conversations, even open up a little, especially if the other person has a calm and emotionally intelligent presence. But the moment that insight starts to create real pressure to change, or even the perception of pressure, they emotionally disengage. They begin to feel like they're being psychoanalyzed, even if that's not the case. And they begin to associate the other person with a loss of emotional safety, not because that person did anything wrong, but because they simply understood them too well. People who see the avoidant clearly are often the ones who could have been the most healing partners. They are typically self-aware, patient, and emotionally grounded. They don't play games. They don't chase. They don't pretend not to notice what's happening. And that is precisely what makes the avoidant feel uneasy. Because emotional honesty removes the avoidant's ability to hide. It takes away their illusion of control. It exposes the emotional math they don't want to do. And instead of feeling grateful for that honesty, they feel threatened by it. This is why avoidants rarely return to the people who saw through them, because doing so would mean coming back to someone who already knows the game, someone who can't be manipulated with distance, silence, or emotional inconsistency, someone who will gently but firmly hold them accountable, not in a punishing way, but in a real, human, and relational way. And that level of emotional clarity is something avoidants often aren't ready for. They prefer the relationships where their behavior goes unchecked, where they can disappear without questions, where they can show up half present and still be accepted, but the person who sees them for who they are, who brings awareness into the dynamic, who quietly challenges the emotional avoidant patterns, they are remembered but rarely revisited.